Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and today I'll be your companion on a gentle journey into sleep. Before we begin, take a deep breath, relax, and don't forget to support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now lie back, close your eyes, and let this story guide you into a mysterious world filled with wonders, accompanied by the soft patter of rain in the background. I've never been a superstitious person, but that night changed me forever. It was a stormy night, and I was staying in an old wooden cabin deep in the forests of Oregon. No neighbors, no cell phone signal. I thought this would be the perfect hideaway, somewhere I could escape the noise of the city and focus on my next book. It was around 2 in the morning, and the rain had become a steady, rhythmic backdrop to the silence in the cabin. I was reading by the dim light of a lamp when a loud, sudden noise shattered the calm. A rapid, almost desperate knock at the door that nearly made me drop my book. The cabin was isolated in the heart of the woods, and at that hour, the idea of someone knocking was impossible. My pulse quickened as I crept closer to the door, holding my breath. Outside was nothing but a black void, no sign of life. I stood there, my heart pounding, listening as rain drummed steadily against the cabin walls. Then, it happened again. The knocking, more intense, more insistent, as if someone or something was desperate to get in. I opened the door with the slight hope of finding some logical explanation, but as the door swung open, there was only darkness and the quiet hiss of rain. No one was there. I shut the door and backed away, telling myself it was probably just a branch blown against the door by the wind. But just as I turned to head back to the living room, the knocking started up again, louder, so forceful that the door seemed to shake with each impact. My mind started to race, fragments of local ghost stories flashing before my eyes. They'd warned me about this place, about a family that had once lived here, brutally murdered decades ago, and whose spirits were said to still roam the woods. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, but every creepy detail I'd been told resurfaced, echoing in my mind. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. Rain poured down, chilling me to the bone, and the woods around me were dark and silent. I scanned the area, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. As I turned to go back inside, I heard it again, the knocking. But this time, it came from inside the cabin. My blood ran cold, and I froze, barely able to breathe. I knew I wasn't imagining things. The sound had come from directly behind me, from within the very house I'd just exited. Slowly, I turned, and there, silhouetted in the window, was a figure staring back at me through the rain-blurred glass. I screamed and ran, sprinting blindly into the woods, hoping to escape that terrifying sight. But as I stumbled through the rain-soaked undergrowth, the knocking continued, following me, keeping pace with each step. The rain drowned out my panicked breaths and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But that knocking was relentless, unyielding. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally stopped, I was lost in the dark, surrounded by trees, the storm still raging. And then, the knocking began again, closer, impossibly close. That's when I realized the sound wasn't coming from the cabin anymore. It was inside my head. Compelled by some unseen force, I stumbled through the woods, following the maddening beat of the knocking until I reached a gnarled old oak tree. Strange symbols were carved into its trunk, and as I shone my flashlight over the bark, I saw a fresh message scrawled in what looked like blood. Enter. I looked around frantically, but I was alone in the darkness. I tried to run again, but a freezing hand grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back toward the tree. Before I could scream, everything went black, and I collapsed under the relentless rain. When I regained consciousness, I found myself back in the cabin, but everything was wrong. The rain had stopped, and the light had disappeared. All that remained was darkness, and the endless, ceaseless knocking, echoing through the silence. I've tried to escape that cabin countless times, but every time I think I'm free, I realize I'm still there, still trapped, still hearing that infernal knocking that never stops. And now, I'm no longer sure what's real and what isn't. I only know one thing: I'm never getting out. I remember that night all too well. I was driving back home from a small bar on the outskirts of a Texas town. The rain pounded against my windshield, relentless, each drop like it was trying to wash the road out of existence. I turned the wipers on full speed, squinting through the thick sheets of rain. Somehow, that drive home felt longer than ever before. About half an hour out of town, just as exhaustion was setting in, I caught sight of something on the side of the road, a figure, shadowy and still. I figured it was a trick of the rain, maybe my tired eyes playing games. But as I got closer, I could see him, a tall, thin man, cloaked in a long black raincoat, just standing there, motionless. I slowed down as I drove past him and glanced in the rearview mirror. He just stood there, didn't wave, didn't signal for help, nothing. Oddly enough, when my headlights swept over his face, I couldn't see any details. It was like his face was obscured by the darkness itself. My pulse quickened and I tried to shake off the image, telling myself he was just a stranger caught in the rain. I kept driving, trying to let the rhythm of the rain calm me down. But 5 minutes later, there he was again, standing in the middle of the road up ahead. This time he was positioned dead center, forcing me to hit the brakes hard. My car screeched to a halt, and for a moment the only sound was the heavy patter of rain around me. I couldn't understand how he'd managed to get there so fast. It was impossible. A cold chill ran down my spine. My instincts told me to drive away, but curiosity got the best of me. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window and leaned out, rain soaking my arm as I called out, "Do you need a ride?" The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his face still hidden in the shadow of his hood. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his gaze boring into me. Turning away, I muttered to myself, hoping he'd move along on his own. But he didn't. After a few tense moments, I decided he was probably lost or disoriented. I unlocked the door, reluctantly gesturing for him to get in. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, but as strange as it sounds, I didn't hear his footsteps, nor did I feel the weight of him sitting down. Trying to ignore the unsettling feeling, I resumed driving, but his presence made my skin crawl. I stole glances at him in the rearview mirror, and each time I looked, his face seemed blurry, as though he were shrouded in mist. I gripped the wheel tighter, my heart racing as I fought to keep calm. After what felt like ages of silence, I mustered the courage to ask, "Where are you headed?" He tilted his head slightly, his voice a low, hollow echo, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Home," he replied. Just that one word, but the chill in his voice was enough to make my stomach twist. I wanted to ask him more, but something inside me held back, as if I knew I wouldn't like the answers. I glanced at him again in the mirror. His face had begun to change. What was once indistinct was now taking shape, a pair of deep-set eyes, skin pale as death, and a twisted, unnatural smile. Slowly his eyes shifted, meeting mine in the mirror. A wave of dread washed over me, freezing my hands on the wheel. I looked away, staring straight ahead, my only focus to get away from him as fast as I could. But no matter how much I sped up, I could still feel his eyes on me, piercing, unyielding. Then, just as my terror reached its peak, the impossible happened. My car's engine sputtered, the headlights dimmed, and the car came to a halt, dead in the middle of the road. Panic seized me. I tried turning the key again and again, but the engine was silent. The only sound was the rain drumming against the roof. I turned to the man, hoping he could help, but when I looked over, the passenger seat was empty. He was gone. I stared at the vacant seat, trying to convince myself that he'd never been there at all, that it had all been in my mind. But a strange, earthy smell lingered in the air, a smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. I sat there in the dark, rain hammering around me, fear rooting me to my seat. I don't know how long I stayed there, but finally, when the worst of my terror had passed, I opened the door and started running down the road, desperate to reach any signs of life. and that should have been the end of it. But now, every night, I hear footsteps following me, shadows creeping in the mirrors. I see him, the rain-soaked man, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. He's never really left. He's still there, watching, waiting, as if he'll follow me forever. I never thought I'd end up living in an old house deep in the woods, but when my work demanded absolute quiet and some distance from the city, this place became my only option. Nestled in the mountains of Colorado, far from the nearest town, the house was surrounded by dense trees that seemed to swallow the landscape. Every evening, as the sun set, darkness would blanket the area, and the quiet would become almost oppressive. For most people, this house would be a nightmare, but at first I found the isolation kind of exciting. During the day, the woods behind the house looked beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the branches and the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of leaves. But at night, it was a different story. The darkness became thicker, soundless, and somehow threatening. One rainy night, close to midnight, I was about to head to bed when I noticed something strange. A faint light flickering deep within the woods. At first I brushed it off as headlights or maybe campers, but then I realized there weren't any roads back there. The light seemed to blink, then disappear, as if whoever was holding it was trying to hide. I stood by the window, caught between curiosity and unease, and then the light blinked back on, closer this time, weaving between the trees. Before I knew it, I'd thrown on my raincoat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the rain, moving toward the woods to see what was going on. The rain poured down, masking the sounds of my footsteps as I made my way deeper into the forest. But each time I moved, I thought I heard another set of footsteps close behind me. Whenever I turned around, though, there was nothing but darkness. It was enough to put me on edge, but I kept going, following what little I could see of the trail. I didn't see the light anymore, but I was certain I was on the right path. Footprints marked the muddy ground, leading me further into the thick of the woods. Eventually, I reached a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. Suddenly, an unnatural chill washed over me, one that had nothing to do with the rain. The forest had fallen eerily silent. No rain, no wind, just an oppressive, all-consuming stillness. I raised my flashlight and saw something that froze me in place. A deep hole dug into the ground, surrounded by disturbed soil. Beside the hole stood a crooked, weathered wooden cross, half buried in the mud. My flashlight flickered over the muddy ground, and I saw something half buried there, barely visible but clearly out of place. I took a step back, a surge of fear clawing at me. Then, from somewhere behind me, a soft, chilling laugh echoed through the trees. The sound was low, almost like a whisper, but it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip, but there was no one there, only the darkness, thick and suffocating. Panic surged in me, and I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But then I heard a whisper, soft and indistinct, almost as if someone were speaking in my ear. The words didn't make sense, fragments of phrases and strange sounds that seemed to weave into the rain. I turned to leave, but as I did, my flashlight illuminated a face. Pale and hollow-eyed, the figure's gaze was fixed on me, lips slightly parted as if mid-sentence. My scream caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I felt like something was holding me in place, paralyzed with fear. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to turn and run back toward the house. But no matter how fast I moved, the forest seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, my feet slipping on the wet ground. Finally, I saw the faint glow of my house's lights through the trees. I sprinted inside, slammed the door, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. I tried to convince myself it had been a bad dream or some strange hallucination. But when I looked down, my shoes were caked in mud and soaked leaves. I was safe, but that sense of security didn't last long. Every night after that, I'd see a light flickering in the forest. I tried ignoring it, but the whispers would return each time I closed my eyes. It felt like I was no longer alone in my own home. Something had seen me, and now it wasn't willing to let me go. The woods behind the house weren't just an innocent patch of forest anymore. They had become a nightmare, creeping into my sleep, pulling me back night after night. And every time I'd dream of being there again, standing in the darkness in front of that bottomless pit and that crooked cross, hearing the cold, bone-chilling laughter echoing in my mind. New Orleans is a strangely beautiful city, alluring and mysterious, especially at night. The old streets are lit by dim, yellow streetlights, and narrow alleyways seem to disappear into the darkness. That night I was wandering along the cobblestone paths of the French Quarter, light rain misting down, casting a faint shimmer over everything. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, the faint melody of a piano drifting out from a distant bar, and the soft glow of the lights made the city feel both magical and haunting. It was close to midnight, and the streets had grown quiet with only a few people here and there, moving like shadows. This was when the city seemed most alive to me, wrapped in mystery, as if the old buildings held secrets hundreds of years old. I'd wandered deep into the quarter without realizing it, down narrow lanes that seemed to coil and twist, farther from the sounds of the city. The silence settled around me, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing on the stone. That was when a strange sensation crept over me, the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped, straining to hear past the rain, but there was nothing. Taking a deep breath, I glanced behind me, shining my phone's flashlight down the alley. There was only darkness, the yellow streetlights casting long shadows along the damp brick walls. I shook my head, laughing nervously, reassuring myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned to walk away, the streetlight above flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A shadowy figure at the end of the alley, motionless, just standing there, watching. When the light came back on, the figure was gone. A wave of unease washed over me. I brushed it off and kept walking, picking up my pace, but the image of that shadow haunted me. A few minutes later, I saw it again. The same figure, this time closer, only a few yards away. It was as if it moved whenever the light faltered, inching closer with each flicker. My heart pounded, and I quickened my steps, nearly breaking into a jog as I wound through the maze-like alleys. But no matter how far I went, the shadow kept appearing, always behind me, silent, moving closer each time. I could hear something strange, no footsteps exactly, but a faint, eerie scraping sound, like sand being crushed underfoot. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight ahead, but the shadow was gone. And yet, there was something strange in the light, a faint mist, barely visible, hovering in the air. Then, suddenly, a chill swept through me, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to freeze me to the core. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. The screen was black, as if all the power had been drained from it. Panic started to set in, the fear tightening my chest. There was nothing left but me and the silence, a silence so thick it felt like a living thing pressing in on me. Then, breaking that silence, I heard it, a soft, almost whispered sigh, close enough to make my skin crawl. The sound was low but unmistakable, and it came from behind me. I turned slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There it was, the shadow, standing right in front of me, barely an arm's length away. Its face was indistinct, but its eyes were black voids, like empty doorways that seemed to pull me in. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't look away. The shadow just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back. But for every step I took, the shadow seemed to follow. I backed away slowly, 1 foot at a time, my entire body screaming at me to run. But as I reached the edge of the alley, the shadow suddenly vanished without a trace. I stood there, breathless, my pulse racing, struggling to process what had just happened. Then, without looking back, I sprinted out of the alley and onto the main street, back into the light and the safety of the crowds. I didn't stop until I was surrounded by people again, under the bright lights of the quarter. But ever since that night, I know the shadow is still there, hiding in the dark corners of those old, narrow streets. And whenever I pass through the quarter at night, I can feel it. The cold gaze from some distant, forgotten place, following my every step. In the village, everyone knew about the house at the end of the path. An old, abandoned house, vacant for decades. The walls were stained, the roof was crumbling, and the broken window panes looked like hollow eyes watching everyone who passed by. No one knew exactly who the house had belonged to. It had been deserted for so long, and people avoided it due to countless rumors about strange occurrences there. Since I was a child, I'd heard that on rainy nights, if someone was brave enough to pass by, they'd see a faint light coming from that house. At first, I thought it was just a story to scare kids, but part of me was always curious and ready for a challenge. One night, the rain poured down heavily. I decided to test the story, grabbing a small flashlight, donning an old raincoat, and heading down the path to the abandoned house. The cold wind blew, bringing dampness that seeped into my skin and made me shiver. The path became slippery, but I kept going, a strange mix of anxiety and excitement welling up inside. As I approached the house, my heart began to pound. Through the misty rain, I saw a faint light coming from a window on the second floor. It flickered, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, as if someone were holding a candle, pacing back and forth. I was terrified, but couldn't stop my feet from moving closer. I reached the door and placed my hand on the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a cold, dark interior. I shone my flashlight inside, sweeping across each corner of the house. Everything was covered in dust, cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was thick with an unsettling mustiness. Slowly, I stepped up the wooden staircase, each step creaking under my weight. As I climbed, the light from the second floor grew brighter. By now, I was certain I wasn't imagining it. The light was real. When I reached the top, the light suddenly went out, plunging everything into pitch-black darkness. I froze, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. Suddenly, from within the darkness, I heard footsteps, soft, yet distinct. They drew closer, one step at a time, steady and deliberate. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing except darkness. When the footsteps stopped, I turned to look at the far end of the hallway. There, a shadow stood motionless in the dark. It had no face, just a hazy figure, as if made from mist. My heart raced wildly. I wanted to scream but couldn't make a sound. The figure slowly raised an arm, pointing toward the end of the hall, where the only door on the second floor stood slightly ajar, and the faint light flickered from within once more. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to approach that room, as though an invisible force was guiding me. When I stood in front of the door, my heart nearly stopped. Inside the room was an old table, on top of which sat an oil lamp. Its weak glow illuminated the room. But there was something else, a dusty journal on the table. I shakily picked it up and opened it. Yellowed pages appeared before my eyes, with faded handwriting from years gone by. The contents detailed the life of someone who had once lived in this house. And the most terrifying thing was the final page, filled with an ominous message. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't escape. Startled, I dropped the book and turned to look at the shadowy figure. It had disappeared, leaving only an empty room and the sound of rain continuing outside. I bolted down the stairs, leaving everything behind, and ran out into the rain. Since that night, I've never dared return to the abandoned house, but a strange feeling lingers within me. I'm not sure if I truly escaped that house or if I'm still haunted by the shadow that watched my every step that night. That night, the rain fell steadily, heavy drops pouring down without pause, creating a sorrowful melody that echoed through the air. I still remember the chilling sensation of the rain soaking into my skin as I decided to walk down the quiet path near my home. It was a strangely dark night, with a gloomy sky devoid of stars, only darkness all around and the rhythmic sound of rain. In that thick darkness, just as my footsteps began to feel lonely, I heard a strange sound from afar. It was a soft singing voice, gently humming amidst the rain. The voice blended with the sound of the rain, yet it carried a different tone. Sad, haunting, like a distant call from the past. I stopped, trying to listen more closely. The song was faint, sometimes nearly drowned out by the rain, but just when I thought it had vanished, it re-emerged, pulling me toward it. My instincts warned me that something was wrong, but curiosity won over my fear. I followed the voice down a path that led into a small forest near my home. The deeper I went into the woods, the clearer the voice became, enchanting, with an invisible pull I couldn't resist. I felt as though I was being led, as if the singer wanted me to come closer, closer still. After a while, I reached a clearing in the forest. In the faint glow of a distant streetlight, I saw a blurry figure standing in the rain. It was a woman, dressed in a long white dress, her dark hair flowing down, head bowed. The voice came from her, humming, sad, and filled with sorrow. I stood there, frozen, unable to take another step. She didn't look at me, just kept singing in the rain, her voice as faint as a lullaby lost in the tide of life. I tried to step back, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The cold of the rain and wind seeped into my skin, yet I couldn't leave. And then suddenly, she stopped singing. She raised her head, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Her eyes were empty, soulless, like a bottomless abyss, where every hint of light was swallowed whole. In that instant, it felt as though time had stopped, and everything around us plunged into absolute silence. Suddenly, I heard a whisper echoing in my head. "You can hear me. Don't leave me." Unable to bear it any longer, I backed away, trying to escape from that haunting gaze. But the further I ran, the clearer I heard footsteps following me, step by step, steadily. I knew then that I was no longer alone. Eventually, I reached the main road and saw the lights from a nearby house. I knocked on the door in a panic, and an older man opened it, looking at me with surprise. I recounted everything, but he just chuckled softly, suggesting that I was likely just tired and imagining things. As I was about to leave, he mentioned that a girl had gone missing in that forest long ago. She was said to have met with an accident on a rainy night while waiting for her lover, who never arrived. It's said her spirit still roams there, singing a sorrowful song in the rain, waiting for someone who will never return. I shivered, looking out into the night where the rain still fell unceasingly. In the darkness, I could swear I saw her figure gliding through the forest, and the song played again, gentle, haunting, like a mournful lullaby from a distant realm. The park near my house is a peaceful place during the day, but at night it transforms completely. The atmosphere takes on a dark shroud, with tall trees stretching out as if to embrace anyone who dares enter. Perhaps that's why so few people go there after dark. I'd often heard rumors about a strange shadow appearing in the park at night, but I never believed them. I always thought it was just a story meant to scare the neighborhood kids. That night I was feeling tense and couldn't sleep. To shake off the feeling, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. On impulse, I decided to walk to the park, even though it was late and the surroundings were cloaked in an eerie silence. A light drizzle began to fall, with tiny droplets creating a mist that covered everything in a hazy veil. I walked along the familiar stone path, dim streetlights casting my shadow long on the ground. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, producing a haunting sound. I tried to reassure myself that it was just an ordinary park, and there was nothing to fear. However, as I ventured deeper into the park, a strange feeling began to creep in. Everything around me grew unnervingly silent, leaving only the soft patter of rain and the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. My footsteps slowed, each one echoing in the empty space. Suddenly, I felt as if someone was watching me. The sensation was so strong I couldn't ignore it. I turned around, but there was nothing behind me, only empty benches and the long shadows of trees on the rain-soaked ground. I continued walking, but with every step I heard another set of footsteps mirroring mine. These steps weren't mine, but belonged to someone attempting to mask their presence. My breathing quickened, my heart racing as if in a countdown. Instinctively, I turned once more, and this time, I saw it. In the distance, shrouded by mist, stood a dark figure, unmoving, as if it had been watching me all along. The shadow stood in complete silence, never moving, its gaze fixed on me through the rain. The figure was tall and slender, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed, like two dark chasms pulling me in. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. It was only a few dozen meters away, and the chill from its gaze pierced straight into my chest, making it hard to breathe. Instinctively, I took a step back, but the figure remained still, watching my every movement, as if waiting for something. I tried to keep calm and decided to leave the park, but the further I walked, the closer the shadow seemed to get, step by step. I could hear its footsteps, soft yet chilling, like whispers echoing in my mind. At that moment, panic took over. I quickened my pace, trying to escape the park, but the footsteps continued to follow, never ceasing. I broke into a run as the rain intensified, blurring my vision, yet I knew the shadow was still chasing me. As I neared the park's entrance, I felt an icy chill right behind me, as if the shadow had almost reached me, close enough to touch if I slowed down. In a split second, I turned and saw the shadow right before me, just a few steps away. Its face was entirely blank, with no eyes, nose, or mouth. Just a black void, an endless abyss, and from it came a faint laugh, soft yet horrifying, echoing through the dark night. The laugh wasn't human. It was like the tortured soul of something imprisoned, haunting anyone who dared enter its domain. In that moment, I felt as if I was being pulled into its hollow eyes, staring into endless despair. My legs felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I just stood there facing the terrifying shadow, unable to break free. But then a crack of thunder split the sky, and lightning flashed across the park. In that brief moment, the shadow vanished. I snapped out of my stupor, and without a second thought, I ran out of the park, never looking back. Since that night, I've never dared step foot in the park after dark. Whenever it rains, I still remember that shadow with its empty face. Perhaps it's still there, waiting for the next brave soul to step into the park on a rainy night, ready to haunt them with its hollow eyes and ghostly laugh. That night, it poured rain. I stood under the awning of a closed shop trying to find a taxi to get home. For some reason, the downpour had started just as I finished work, and no taxi had passed by this deserted area. Just as I was about to give up and look for a place to stay nearby, a black taxi appeared out of the rain. It stopped right in front of me, its dim yellow lights illuminating the rain like strokes of a dark, somber painting. Relieved, I got in without hesitation, grateful to finally have a way home. As soon as I shut the door, a strange feeling crept over me. The taxi's interior was unusually cold, a chill that seemed to come not from the air conditioning, but from something more mysterious. The driver said nothing, just stared straight ahead, his face pale, eyes hollow in the rearview mirror, giving me an involuntary shiver. "Take me to Nam Bin district," I said with a slight tremor in my voice. The driver didn't respond, just pressed the gas and the car began to move. The road was dark, and trees passed by the window, casting eerie shapes in the glow of the headlights. The taxi moved in complete silence without a sound from the engine, heightening my sense of unease. Only the rain and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers broke the silence, like the heartbeat of an invisible force. Gradually, I realized the route was not leading to my home. The surroundings grew increasingly unfamiliar and foggy. Sitting up straight, I looked through the windshield, noticing that the taxi was heading down a completely unknown road, shrouded in thick fog with no streetlights in sight. "Driver, "I think you've taken the wrong route," I said, my voice tinged with worry. But he remained silent, his hollow eyes focused ahead, as if he hadn't heard a word. Real fear took hold of me as I repeated myself more clearly, but this time, instead of silence, the driver turned to look at me. His face was blank, his eyes dark, as if they were bottomless voids. His gaze felt like it pierced right through me, chilling me to the bone. Panicked, I tried the door handle, but it was locked from the inside. I couldn't get it open, and the sound of the rain seemed completely isolated, leaving only a suffocating silence in the car. Suddenly, the taxi veered onto a dirt road through the woods. The path became increasingly desolate and narrow, flanked by massive trees whose dark silhouettes cast grotesque shadows over the taxi. There was no exit in sight, no familiar signs. Just an endless dark road and the eerie taxi pulling me deeper into the shadows. "Where are you taking me?" I shouted in desperation, but the driver didn't answer, his soulless eyes fixed straight ahead. Unexpectedly, a faint, eerie laugh echoed from deep within the forest, weak, yet haunting, as if the forest itself was alive and mocking my helplessness. My heart raced, my palms turned icy, and I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The taxi suddenly stopped. I looked outside and saw that I was in the middle of the forest, with no sign of light or life. All around was darkness and the sound of rain falling on the leaves. I had no idea what to do. My thoughts were a chaotic mess of fear and panic. The driver slowly turned to face me, his empty eyes boring into mine, and in a cold, lifeless voice he said, "This is the end of the journey." His words echoed in my head like an inescapable sentence. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak. Suddenly, he reached out, and as his fingers touched mine, I realized they were icy, like death itself. In that moment, I summoned every ounce of strength I had, flung open the door, and bolted into the forest, rain soaking me as I ran. I didn't dare look back, only focused on getting as far away as possible from the taxi and its eerie driver. The ghostly laughter still echoed behind me, blending with the rain, following each step I took. Finally, I reached a main road, and to my surprise, a taxi's headlights appeared down the road. I waved frantically, and the driver, a normal man with a concerned look, asked if I needed help. I shakily recounted what had happened, but he only looked at me in disbelief. I didn't blame him. Even I couldn't believe what I had just experienced. Once safely home, I swore never to take a taxi at night again. Although it was over, a part of me still feels like that shadowy figure and the strange taxi are watching me, waiting for another rainy night to complete the final journey I had tried so desperately to escape. That night, after a long, exhausting day at work, I came home in the heavy rain. The gloomy, cold weather and the constant drizzle seemed to blend with my exhaustion, creating a feeling of emptiness and unease. As I stepped into my room, I sighed in relief, turned on the light, and threw myself onto the bed, deciding to scroll through my phone a bit before sleeping. While checking through old messages, I stumbled upon something strange. In my photo album, there was a new picture, one I was certain I hadn't taken. I opened the photo and my heart sank. It was a picture taken right in my bedroom. The photo showed me fast asleep, lying in bed with the blanket pulled up to my chest. The angle was from the head of the bed, directly facing my face, capturing me in a completely vulnerable state, completely unaware. But the most terrifying part wasn't that I couldn't remember taking it. It was the blurry figure standing next to my bed, staring directly at me. A cold chill ran down my spine. I lived alone, and I always locked the door before sleeping. So who could have been in my room to take this photo? I didn't dare think too deeply about it. I just sat there, staring at the photo on my phone with indescribable fear. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a phone glitch, or maybe a prank. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. No one could have entered my house. There was no rational explanation for the photo's existence. In that moment, fear engulfed me. I decided to thoroughly check the room. I turned on every light, searched every corner, from under the bed to every cabinet, but found nothing unusual. Everything was still as it should be, with only the sound of rain tapping against the window, a sound that only made me more anxious. After finding no trace of anything strange, I returned to bed and tried to sleep, but couldn't close my eyes. The image of that photo haunted me, making me glance around the room repeatedly, dreading that the figure might appear at any moment. About an hour later, as I was drifting in and out of tense exhaustion, my phone suddenly vibrated. I opened my eyes, grabbed the phone, and saw there was another new photo in the album. My heart stopped as I opened the picture. This time, the photo was taken from the bedroom doorway, showing the entire room and me curled up on the bed in fear. Even worse, the figure was there again, more clearly visible this time, standing in the middle of the room, staring directly at the camera as if sending a silent message. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, turned on every light in the house, and huddled on the sofa, clutching my phone tightly. I tried calling friends, but no one answered. Outside, the rain poured down, the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, blending with the frantic pounding of my heart. In that moment, I heard a faint sound from the bedroom. Soft footsteps, but clear, as if someone was walking around the room. I didn't dare look, frozen in place, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone, trying to check it again. But as I looked at the screen, I was startled to see yet another new photo had appeared. It was a picture of me from behind as I huddled on the sofa. This photo was crystal clear, and the figure, with its pale, cold face, was staring at me from just behind my shoulder. In that moment, I felt paralyzed. My entire body went cold, my limbs shaking, unable to move. I knew I couldn't stay there another moment. Grabbing my phone, I left everything behind and dashed out of the apartment into the pouring rain. I ran through the dark streets, not daring to look back. I never returned to that apartment. The next day, I moved to a new place, hoping to escape the nightmare. But the memory of that rainy night, of the strange photos and the haunting figure, still lingers. Sometimes at night, while I'm sleeping, my phone will vibrate with a new photo. And in those pictures, the blurry figure is always there, a reminder that I can never truly escape. That night, the rain poured endlessly. Heavy raindrops pounded against the window, filling my quiet apartment with a steady, eerie sound. I lived alone in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building. There was nothing remarkable about the place, but I'd always loved it because from the large living room window, I could see the city lights shimmering in the distance. The rain continued to fall, and as usual, I sat by the window with a warm cup of tea, watching each raindrop glide down the glass. Tonight, however, there was something different about the scene outside. A misty fog enveloped everything, making the streetlights appear hazy and surreal, like a dreamlike ink painting. I sat there for a long time, my eyelids growing heavy in the rhythm of the rain. But suddenly, something strange caught my attention. On the surface of the window, my reflection seemed different. In the silent night, I noticed that the face looking back at me didn't quite match mine. Its eyes were hollow and dark, filled with an inexplicable coldness. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just tired and that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the longer I looked, the more unsettling it became. My face in the reflection looked cold and menacing, as if it were someone else staring back at me rather than my own image. I stood up and moved closer to the window, staring intently at my reflection. In that moment, I realized something chilling. The reflection wasn't mirroring my movements. I raised an eyebrow, but the face in the glass stayed still, its vacant eyes locked on me, even tilting its head slightly as if it were observing me with a detached curiosity. A wave of fear crept over me. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the reflection, and that's when something horrifying happened. The face in the window slowly started to smile, a cold, sinister smile that no human would ever make. My heart pounded. and cold sweat broke out over my skin. That image wasn't just a reflection. It felt conscious, alive, as if it were looking at me with a mocking gaze. Unable to bear it, I ran out of the room, trying to calm myself. But even away from the window, the image of that face lingered in my mind. I curled up on the sofa, breathing deeply to steady my nerves, but questions kept swirling in my head. Was it an illusion? Was I just losing my mind from living alone for too long? After a few minutes, I decided to return to the living room, hoping it was all in my imagination. But when I entered, I was paralyzed by what I saw. My reflection was still there in the window, but it wasn't standing where I had left it. It was now in the middle of the living room, as though it had stepped out of the glass and into my space. The faint, sinister smile remained on its face, and its eyes were locked on me as if waiting for a reaction. In that terrifying moment, I stumbled back, my mouth dry, unable to make a sound. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it gradually filling the room, pressing down on me with a suffocating dread. I didn't know what to do. Time felt frozen, with only my fear taking over every thought. Suddenly the phone rang, shattering the dreadful silence. Startled, I rushed to the phone, and as I picked it up, I heard a soft, chilling voice. "You think you can escape me?" Panicking, I dropped the phone and bolted out of the room. But just as I reached the door, I realized something horrifying. The reflection in the window was gone. It had vanished. I backed away, looking around the room, but there was no sign of it. I felt an eerie presence behind me, watching every breath I took. I didn't dare turn around, sprinting out of the apartment and down the stairs, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help me. I never returned to that apartment. The next day, I moved out without collecting any belongings. But ever since, I've felt as if that reflection is still watching me, as though it escaped the glass and now lingers in my life, waiting for another rainy night to return. That night, the rain poured down heavily, and fierce winds whipped through the trees, creating a mysterious symphony of rain and gusts. After finishing my work, I collapsed onto my bed, feeling both exhausted and relieved. In the soft, dim glow of my small room, all I wanted was a deep, peaceful sleep. Just as I was drifting off, my phone rang, jolting me awake. I glanced at the clock, nearly 2 a.m. An unknown number was calling. For a few seconds, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the best of me. I picked up and raised the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered, a sense of unease creeping in. There was no response. All I could hear were the soft sounds of rain on the other end, mixed with faint static as though the connection was weak. I listened intently, my heart pounding, trying to discern if there was any voice within the noise. After a moment of silence, a faint voice emerged. Soft, but clear. It was a woman's voice, distant, as if calling from far away. "Can you hear me?" A chill ran down my spine. The voice sounded filled with sorrow, like someone pleading for help. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and replied, "I can hear you. Who are you?" There was another pause. Then the voice continued, quiet but haunting. "Please, help me. I can't leave here." The words were broken, weak but unmistakably desperate, as if being suppressed by something unseen. I didn't understand what was happening, but fear started seeping into me. "Where are you? How can I help?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman's voice returned, clearer this time, but filled with despair. "I don't know. It's so dark and cold. Please don't leave me." Questions raced through my mind. Why was a stranger calling me in the middle of the night? And why was her voice so haunting? I tried to ask again. "Do you know where you are? How can I help you?" But all I heard in return was a stifled sob. Her voice broke, and then she started sobbing. And suddenly the call disconnected, leaving me in the terrifying silence of my room. I tried calling the number back, but all I got was a message. "The number you have dialed does not exist." This only deepened my confusion and fear. Was it a call from the beyond, or a sick joke played by someone? After that night, I tried to forget the strange event, but on the following rainy nights, the unknown number called again. Each time I answered, the woman's voice came through, still filled with that agonizing despair. "Please help me. Don't leave me." Each time I heard her, I felt my heart tighten, a mix of sympathy and terror welling up inside. She repeated the same heartbreaking pleas, always begging for help, but never revealing where she was or how I could reach her. I began to lose sleep, anxious each night that I'd receive a call from that strange number. Every time the phone rang, it felt like an invisible hand was gripping my heart. The fear and helplessness started to drive me to the brink of panic. One rainy night, after receiving yet another call, I couldn't take it anymore and yelled in desperation, "What can I do to help you? Just tell me clearly." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then her voice returned, colder than ever. "You will never escape me." Her words sounded like a curse. After that sentence, the call ended. I sat there frozen, feeling paralyzed, surrounded by a suffocating fear. Since that night, I haven't received any more calls from the unknown number, but on rainy nights, I can't shake the feeling that an invisible gaze is watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, in the dead silence, I hear a faint whisper close to my ear. "You will never escape." Since moving to the new apartment, I noticed something strange about my daughter, Lily. Usually bright and lively, she had become quiet and withdrawn, no longer running around or playing with me. Instead, she would sit alone in the corner, murmuring to someone I couldn't see. At first, I thought it was just her imagination, a phase where she created her own little world. One evening, I heard her laughing in her bedroom, mixed with the sound of an animated conversation. Standing outside her door, I peeked through the crack and saw her sitting on the bed, her face lit up as if she were chatting with a close friend. "Mommy, this is my friend Sarah," she said, noticing me at the door. I looked around but saw no one. "Who's Sarah, honey?" I asked, puzzled. "She's sitting right here next to me." Lily pointed to the empty space beside her. "Sarah is really nice and always plays with me, but she only comes when it rains at night." A chill ran through me. From that night on, I started paying more attention to Lily's conversations with Sarah. Whenever it rained, she would sit alone, chatting and laughing. The interactions became stranger each night, and as the hours grew later, her voice would take on a quieter, more chilling tone. One stormy night, I decided to sit outside her bedroom door to listen closely. Through the crack, I could hear her speaking softly, her voice filled with a mysterious intensity. "Sarah says we'll be together forever, even if I'm no longer here." My heart stopped at those words. I burst into the room, turned on the light, and pulled her close. "Lily, do you know what you're saying? Who is Sarah?" Lily looked at me with confusion. "Mommy, you scared Sarah. She said she'll wait for me on the next rainy night." Her words made my skin crawl. I decided to take her out of the apartment on rainy nights, hoping the strange events would end. But each time we returned, I found small footprints on Lily's bedroom floor, even though the room was locked when we left. The night was late, and the rain continued its steady fall. The stories had ended, but had the fear truly left? Or did shadowy figures and distant calls still linger in the dark whenever it rained? Perhaps these stories were just imagination, but maybe they were fragments of forgotten memories, waiting for another rainy night to remind us of things we can't explain, things that exist between worlds. So be careful whenever you hear a knock, a whisper in the dark, or see fleeting shapes in the window. Rainy nights are often when the invisible becomes visible, and only with the dawn can we truly breathe a sigh of relief. Tonight's story ends here. But remember, when the rain falls at night, the shadows may still be there, waiting for a time we least expect. Thank you for joining me on these stories. Let me know if you want to hear more in the next episode. In the end, I couldn't take it any longer. I decided to move away from the frightening rainy nights and Lily's strange friend. However, on our last night in the old apartment before we moved out, I heard Lily's laughter coming from the bedroom one last time. But this time, her laugh was mixed with another, a faint, ghostly chuckle that seemed to echo from a distant place. The next day, we moved far away. Since then, Lily has never mentioned Sarah again. But sometimes on rainy nights, as I watch my daughter sleeping, I can't shake the feeling of invisible eyes watching us from the darkness, as if Sarah hasn't quite let go of us yet.